and welcome to another episode of In Session, Bennington to Montpelier. I am your host, Jack Rossiter-Munley, coming to you from the beautiful Bennington County Multicultural Community Center here in downtown Bennington. And I am so happy to be joined this morning by three members of our legislative delegation, Representatives Michael Nigro, Mary Morrissey, and David Durfee. Welcome to all three of you.
Good morning.
Good morning,
And I am going to go directly over to Representative Michael Nigro, who is on the show for the first time this season. And I'm going to give you the same intro question that I gave to everybody. Last year, it was a question about what inspired you to get into political life generally and why you've chosen this form of community service. And this year, I'm curious, who is someone who is a political inspiration or role model for you as a person? Could be an historical figure, a contemporary figure, national, international, local. Who's somebody who you think of? Maybe you're about to have a difficult conversation with a colleague, you're about to go into an important meeting. Who's in the back of your mind, or who are you thinking about in those moments?
That's funny because when I think about it, all of the answers and a bunch pop into my head aren't political people. So, I think you might expect somebody to come up with, Kennedy or Bernie Sanders or some, well-known politician. And I respect a lot of well-known politicians. I also recognize they operate in a style that has never necessarily felt like mine. And when I went, I will say that the former representative from Pownell, Representative Bill Botso, I've always enjoyed talking to him through the years, and he's been a bit of a mentor. And one of the things, I remember him talking years ago, maybe even before I had served, just about the legislature running on relationships and on trust and things of those nature. And so when I think of a lot of the people that the mentors that I think really impact the way I work in the legislature, I don't actually think of folks that have served before. I think of the folks that really taught me throughout my professional career how to work with people with diverse opinions, to appreciate different viewpoints, and to build relationships with people with different viewpoints. I think it's what made me successful in my career, and I think it can be really impactful in the legislature. And I will say one politician here that I think speaks very eloquently about that, which is Patrick Leahy. I've had a chance to hear him speak, meet him frequently in Bennington through while he was serving, and he talks a lot about the importance of trust in trust and relationships in legislating, and although I feel very good in many ways about how that operates in Vermont, of course, Patrick Leahy would often talk about it in the fact that it's lacking on a national level, but I think it's something we still have here in Vermont.
I love that answer, because just because you happen to operate in the realm of politics doesn't necessarily mean you're drawing on inspirations from that world. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. I am going to stick with you because it is your first time on the show, and I've also wanted to make sure everyone gets a chance to introduce their committee work a little bit. You are on the Appropriations Committee in the House. Can you talk a little bit about that committee's work, what you've already done, and what's coming up for you?
Sure. Appropriations Committee is a committee that makes our state budget. We are unique in the fact that we only two bills come out of our committee each year, although a lot of almost every other bill comes through our committee at some point, but only two bills originate in our committee. That is the budget, which is the bulk of the work that we do throughout the session. And we do a budget adjustment once a year, which is kind of a halfway true up of the budget, because when you build a budget, like if you're budgeting for your own home, you might budget how much oil you think you will use during the winter, and then midway through the winter you realize, gosh, it's colder than we realized. we need to tweak the budget. It's warmer than we thought. We've got some extra money. So that's what the budget adjustment is. We actually passed the budget adjustment out of our committee a little over a week ago. And so that has moved on to the Senate. There are some years that the budget adjustment can be a very challenging conversation, very hard decisions. I think we had a pretty straightforward budget adjustment this year that it passed out of my committee unanimously, which is something you don't always get, but we always aim for. We really appreciate it if we can all come to a consensus, and we did on the budget adjustment. It had a lot of just very basic true-ups, corrections in terms of what is actually happening financially in the state. It also, there were a few small things of impact for Bennington in the budget adjustment. We were able to correct a mistake. Really, I would call it a mistake that had left our local substance treatment Turning Point organization underfunded for half the year. And again, that's still waiting to pass the Senate and the governor, but I feel pretty good at this point that it will, and happy that we were able to make a few fixes that are going to help some organizations in Southern Vermont. That said, now we are fully focused on the budget. So from now until we hit the crossover point where we pass our bills out and send them to the Senate, my committee is taking testimony from every department and every agency within the state about their budget, and deciding and assigning, how much to appropriate to that budget. So each member of my committee has a portfolio, so we kind of divide up so that we all become experts in a certain section of the budget. So for instance, yesterday I was meeting with the commissioner and deputy commissioner of the Department of Labor. They're part of my portfolio. So I spent a lot of time on their budget, focusing on what's going on at the Department of Labor and what their financial pressures are. And and again, so we each have little sections that we split up, bring back to our committee and discuss as a whole. And, I guess the overall, like the big picture, I would say, in the budget is that you have to remember a lot of the budget is hard to change. I think people will say, well, boy, why can't you just get this enormous $9 billion budget? Why can't you cut that in half? I mean, a lot of things are kind of routine. We have state employees. State employees get health insurance, and we pay a portion of that, and they get a pension, and we need to make sure we fund their pension. And they, like anyone else, need raise, cost of living adjustments. So a lot of the budget is fairly routine, and then I guess the maybe 25% of the budget that is a little more discretionary is where we start to have a lot of our conversations about what do we focus on, what's our emphasis, what direction do we have to go as a state.
Thank you for that overview. And I want to go over to you, Representative Durfee, just to get the view on that budgeting process from outside of the Appropriations Committee. How has that looked? We know the governor put forward a very modest budget increase this year, but how has that budget adjustment process looked for those of you who are sort of not on the outside, obviously, because you're in the legislature, but just looking in on how that is going forward?
Yeah, well, as Mike said, the Appropriations Committee that he sits on focuses on that day and night, week after week, and we thank them for that. But all of us are involved in some way or another, and in fact, we spent quite a bit of time over the past couple of weeks hearing from the agencies that we have jurisdiction over in the committee that I chair. So the Agriculture Agency came in day before yesterday and gave us they spent an hour essentially going over their budget. And the couple of days earlier, we'd heard from the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation with their proposal. And we've been asked this year to spend a little more time and dig in a little bit deeper into those budgets, uh, given the fact that we're in an environment that is, as again as Mike just mentioned, and I guess as you mentioned, Jack, a fiscal environment that's a little different than the one we've been experiencing the past few years. We we have had, of course, the federal government injected a lot of money into Vermont's coffers post-pandemic, and there was, in part because of that, and just because the economy was racing along, we had, I think, practically 10 years, a decade of revenue forecasts that came in every 6 months that were higher than had been expected. So we've been, budgets have been growing, yes, but also there's been more money to spend, not by raising taxes, but just because the economy has been stronger, and that streak came to an end back in early January when we got the semi-annual forecast, and they said, "Oh, we're taking it down a notch, not a whole lot, but enough that it was down rather than up," and that's pretty significant. I think we it was a good reminder of where we are fiscally. So in our committees, we've been asked to dig a little bit deeper and ask questions that maybe we haven't asked before in our committee, and maybe that the agencies haven't really thought about having to answer as much. So it was a useful exercise. I think that um, those same organizations that come to us, the same parts of government that come in to visit us, they'll also go and see the appropriations committee, and we'll probably have to have more answers than they usually do. Um, I'm it's challenging. There's, just within the Agency of Agriculture, which is a $60 million budget, they've got, I think, 100, I'm going to say 140, 150 staff members, working hard. I mean, no question about it. They've got a lot on their plates, and we collectively ask a lot of them. Their budget is going up less than 2%, and it's around $1 million. And most of that money, in fact, maybe all of it, can be attributed to salary and benefit increases this year. So it's not as though they're proposing, adding new programs, or if they are, they're netting them out by cutting somewhere else. So it's definitely a year of looking a little more closely than we have in the past at the state budget.
That makes a lot of sense. Representative Morrissey, obviously, if you have comments on the budget, I want to give you a chance to voice those. But I also want to ask, sort of specific to your committee of corrections and institutions. Right now, a bill has just come into the committee, H-294, which is related to changing the minimum wage for incarcerated people who are working, and moving that from where people are currently paid to being paid at the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. I am curious to hear how that is progressing in the committee.
Well, we have taken some testimony on it, and it correlates well, let me take a step back. Some folks, don't quite understand, well, why are we paying folks who are incarcerated for, doing a job or work within the facility? And it actually correlates with things that they can buy, or possible or phone calls, or connecting with their family from the correctional facilities. And we heard, or what has been for since this started, it's only a very small amount of money that they make. It's like literally cents that they make for doing a job, and that can buy in the well, we call it the kind of the DOC, which is the Department of Corrections, within each facility, their store where they can get basic, toothbrush, toothpaste, those types of things. They can also, like I said, use the money to help offset, the phone calls or connections that they are allowed to connect with family, or if they are, needing to speak with someone legally, those are all have a little price tag to them that they're able to pay. Literally, it's like 50 cents an hour that, they make. And, the discussion has been, should we, bring it up to the, what would be the minimum wage for, any other person working a job. And that right now has had kind of mixed feelings, but we're receiving the testimony, and I think we'll have many further discussions in regards to it, and to see what can be done or not, and go forth.
And
if you,
sorry, please go ahead.
sorry. Well, I was then going to say, kind of to answer the other side of the question that you said, our connection with the Appropriations Committee. My committee, which again is Building and General Services and Department of Corrections, is a money committee. So we actually work with the representatives that have those sections of the budget in appropriations, and we, because we are a money committee, have to provide some guidance, or after taking usually quite a bit of testimony from the different divisions within both of those agencies, that we do work with a representative from corrections to give our view on, should this go forward, a newly looked at appropriations. Now, like I said, the last time I was on our committee, we used to do a yearly budget, and several years back we've gone to a 2-year budget. So again, we work very closely, and we are a money committee, as is transportation, and then of course appropriations. But we work pretty close-knit in looking at our budgets all the way around.
Excellent. And I guess my my follow-up is just, how will the money side of that play out if this bill goes through and there is this adjustment to minimum wage for incarcerated workers? How does that work on the money side?
Well, it would have to go to other committees of jurisdiction. like I'm sure it would go to the possibly government ops, but I know it would have to go to commerce for the labor side of the issue. It would also go to ways and means as to how we, as a state, would pay the increase and through what means we would be able to pay for it. And then, of course, appropriations definitely works on it. But yes, it would have other committees of jurisdiction that would have to weigh in as well.
Excellent. I want to make sure that we get a chance to discuss something that is really events that have transpired on the Senate side, but have a particular Bennington importance and connection, which is the confirmation of justices to the Vermont Supreme Court, including the confirmation of, well, it's both Christina Nolan and Michael Drescher, but obviously Michael Drescher is the person who's made headlines, mostly because of his work in the last couple of years in which he was a part of the federal cases, prosecuting the federal cases against Mohsen Makhtawi and Romeza Ozturk, and during his time as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Vermont, a position that Christina Nolan also held. The vote to confirm him was a tied vote in the Senate, and then it was broken by the lieutenant governor, and it was a vote that was basically along party lines, except for the two senators from Bennington, Senators Bongartz and Plunkett, who voted to confirm him, leading to the tie that was then broken. In the aftermath, not only were some senators who had voted against his appointment discussing his prosecution of Romeza Ozturk and Mohsen Makhtawi's cases, but some also pointed to the press conference that he attended in Florida with Attorney General Pam Bondi back in September, questioning his judgment and in terms of his involvement with some of the immigration enforcement actions of the current administration that feel out of step with the rule of law. So I'm curious for some of your reflections on that confirmation and the fact that there is this sort of direct Bennington connection to his confirmation. I'll start with you, Representative Nigro.
Yeah, let me say that, first of all, wasn't an easy vote. I think this is one of those times that you sit in the House and you go, kind of happy that we didn't have to do that. But I guess I might go out on a limb a little bit on this, because I think when I first heard the nominations and read just the headline level concerns, I had some concern too. But I will say I haven't had the chance to talk to Senator Bongartz, but I've had the chance to talk to Senator Plunkett, and both before the confirmation and after. And I appreciate that. One of the things that I know he did is he reached out to an awful lot of people. He was very thoughtful in his process of that vote. And he had reached out to me, just asking where I was on that. And, I respect the fact, Rob, Senator Plunkett is a lawyer, has a little bit of a different perspective, shared some of that with me. And I guess what I would say is, I think it's a hard decision, but I think that our senators approached that decision the right way. And whether you agree or disagree with what they decided, I believe they were very thoughtful in trying to decide what their job was and whether or not this was an appropriate nomination, and that they came to believe that they both were. And I respect them making what I know was a politically hard vote. And for anybody who struggles with the way that they voted, I would encourage you to watch their floor speeches, particularly Senator Plunkett's, because I think he spoke very eloquently on the floor, explaining his thinking and his reasoning, and even the fact that he had started thinking he was not going to vote to confirm either, and really did a lot of soul searching to get to that. And I guess that's all I can ask of uh, of a of a representative of our voters. And what I try to bring is to think critically and search one's soul and give the best answer one can. So I appreciate them making a hard vote.
And it was interesting to hear how different parts of the process did seem like they influenced the way that they were thinking about his nomination. Uh, Certainly, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted 3-2 not to recommend his confirmation, and that would also, I think, the reporting on those hearings and the hearings themselves are also instructive in terms of understanding some of the detail of Michael Drescher's involvement with especially Rameza Ozturk and Moussa Mehdawi's cases, and how he approached his involvement with them. But Representative Morrissey, I'm curious for some of your thoughts on this.
Well, like Michael, just said, I think both of our senators, and I know for a fact, took it very serious because, Rob reached out to me, just like he did with Michael, and I'm sure others from our Bennington delegation, to really have an understanding, how people were feeling. And, these discussions are tough because you're hearing and seeing different things in the media, and you are at times appalled by some of the things that are out there. But I think for Rob, and like Michael said, people should really listen to their floor speeches. And I think they were both extremely thoughtful in what they finally made as a decision to confirm or not to confirm. And I think I give them a lot of credit for that, and not because of how they necessarily voted, but because you could see that they really were extremely thoughtful about the decision that they ultimately made. And we often have votes that we have to make within the legislature that are sometimes difficult. I've over the years have been where I was the only person within my party that voted against a bill, and I always try to look at not not the party line or any of that. I try to look at how it's going to affect or be beneficial to not only the constituents that I serve, but all Vermonters. And so those can be very, challenging times, but I give them both credit for their thoughtfulness and that it wasn't just drawn on party, by a party line vote.
And obviously, I want to come to you, Representative Durfee, and I just, again, for context, Moussa Mehdawi and Rameza Ozturk were both taken into custody basically because of their activism work, either pieces they had written or activism that they had engaged in. And when those cases came to the U.S. Attorney for the District of Vermont's office, Michael Drescher's attitude was that he would take those cases on as the prosecutor. And in the hearing with the Judiciary Committee, he expressed that that was his desire to shield others in the office from having to take the brunt of, the potential public backlash and the challenge it would bring them. Many people, I'm sure constituents have written into Senators Baumgartz and Plunkett about the fact that they feel any prosecutor taking on those cases would be an abdication of duty, because those cases were instances of the federal government trying to that those cases were the federal government infringing on the basic First Amendment constitutional right of free speech and the right to peacefully assemble and protest. And so, with that overlay, I think that is part of why the Judiciary Committee took the view they did, even after hearing some of his testimony. But I'm curious for your reflections.
Yeah, a couple things I would add, and I will say, first of all, and I know you'll hear, if you haven't already, and I guess you haven't just because of the timing from the senators themselves, which will probably be more instructive than anything that we might be able to sort of lob in here from the sidelines. I will say, yeah, I mean, I think about those two particular individuals, a poetry student, graduate student who wrote an op-ed piece or an editorial in a student newspaper. That's why she was snatched off the streets, and then a Vermonter who was politically active in New York City. My understanding, and this is a distinction that may not be critical, and I may have it wrong too. I haven't listened to the hearings. I'm basing this on the reporting that I've read, that in Drescher's case, he wasn't prosecuting, he was actually defending against a civil lawsuit that was filed expeditiously by good people here in Vermont to try and get at least one of those folks who'd been detained by ICE out of the system. And he wasn't actually prosecuting that case, he was defending. Does that make any difference? I don't know. I will say that, as the fact that we're talking about this at all, this is very unusual. This rarely, if ever, happens that a nominee comes before the Senate. And that's partly because the nominees the governor chooses from a list of qualified lawyers, prosecutors, judges who've been presented by the nominating board. It's a bipartisan board made up of there are other legislators on the board, Democrats and Republicans, and both Drescher and Nolan, now to be, I think, Justices Drescher and Nolan, passed through that phase of the screening process, and as far as I know, without any objection. And I think, again, for whatever it's worth, that goes to their qualifications outside of their, what happened in this particular case. And I think all the focus has been on Drescher. You mentioned that he was asked to go down to Florida to stand next to Pam Bondi, and they were talking about a human trafficking case. And I flagged that at the time. In fact, I have the newspaper still where that that article appeared in the banner, I think, whenever that was back in the fall. And I did so because I was, at the time, I wasn't thinking that, he's going to be a judge and we need to be, hanging on to press clippings for that. But just because I've been thinking a lot about how the undocumented migrant workers, immigrants in Vermont, how they get here. They don't just get here by themselves. Somebody helps them get here, and that person, if they were caught, would be charged with human trafficking. So it can mean different things. I don't know what it meant in the case of the Florida case. Obviously, there are cases of human trafficking that are horrific, that need to be prosecuted. that involve minors. I don't know the specifics of this one, but uh, yeah, I guess the last thing I would say is that we all wonder, how would I act in a situation like this if I were the U.S. attorney or the acting U.S. attorney and put in this position? Where would I draw the line? And would I realize at the time that this is like a life-defining moment? This is now, being put to the test, and it's just it's food for thought. We're living in times where we all may, before too long, be faced with a situation like that, where we need to make, a critical decision that defines, there could be used to define who we are.
And as you noted, this is one of those times where we are talking about something that we don't normally talk about, which does speak to a lot of the unprecedented features of our current time. And I'm very much looking forward to speaking with Senators Bongartz and Plunkett the next time that they are on the program to hear more directly from them about their deliberative process. And it's been very clear from the comments, especially from Senator Plunkett after the vote, that there was a lot of consideration that went into their decision. But it has been very notable, and it's just something even that I have heard mentioned in casual conversation from folks who don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to this kind of stuff, that people have noted, oh, it was those two guys from Bennington. What does that mean? And people are even paying attention just because they've kind of flagged that. So it'll be very interesting to hear more from them, and definitely something for further reflection. Um, I do want to move to something somewhat hyper local. I was hoping that Representative Greer would be with us to talk about this, but Representative Nigro, I'm hoping you can do a little bit. And that is the Bennington Town Charter changes that were voted through at the last town meeting day and are now up in Montpelier. And so just very quickly, they are H 693, 694, 695, and 696. And that is the Community Policing Advisory Review Board having the ability to review following investigations, the ability of the town manager to be removed by a majority vote of the select board, an option tax on short-term rentals, and giving municipal liens priority over others. The two measures that were on the ballot that did not pass were non-citizen voting, which failed by 75 votes, and youth voting for 16 and 17-year-olds, which failed by 694 votes. So just a little update on what the next steps of that process is and how it's looking for those four changes that were voted through.
Yeah, well, those bills, I believe, were all submitted and are now in the Government Operations Committee. I couldn't tell you, I don't know if anyone else on the call knows if they have started discussion on those. I'm not sure if they have. But usually they would work on this before it comes to a vote by the House. I will say that, there's times with these charter changes that I get a little caught thinking about how to approach. How do you approach something like this? So, I think there's times that a representative may have a certain charter change that comes before them for their community that they go, boy, I don't like that at all. I don't think it's a great idea. And how do you approach that? On the one hand, you could say, well, listen, the voters voted for it, and even if I don't like it, I should just respect that. I mean, you could say not as many voters were at that election than at a lot of them, and so maybe it's so. Anyways, I will say it's an interesting thing to think about, but I couldn't give you any specific update at this point.
That is all right. I'm hoping that Representative Greer will be on an episode soon, because I believe he's taken on sponsoring those and is sort of the main connection point. I don't know if you have any insight, Representative Durfee.
Yeah, I believe that each of the bills has had an introduction in that committee that Mike mentioned, the Government Operations Committee, and hasn't had any further follow-up. I think our rules allow charters Well, the bills have already been introduced. I'm mixing up what happens if they come in after the crossover date, but they're already in the system, um, so they may be able to still work on them. They've got a lot on their plate, but I don't think anything's happened so far.
Excellent. Obviously, we'll stay tuned and we'll see. I think everyone's expectation is that they will end up going through, but you never know, and we'll be interested to hear how that proceeds. Um, I also wanted to talk about the news that came through this week of the nearly $60 million in federal money that is coming to Vermont, that Senators Sanders and Welch announced, and both where that money is going to go and how the legislature may be involved in that. One thing that struck me in a lot of the reporting on it is that there weren't uh, big headlines about projects in the Bennington area, though I know there are certainly some of those monies will come to our area. It was, this housing project in Montpelier, and it's the business park in Brattleboro. So what does that money look like for Vermont and the legislature, but then also more specifically for us in Bennington, or what are our hopes for it? So I'll start with you, Representative Durfee.
Wow. Well, I don't know that I can say very much because um, I'm not. Maybe somebody on one of the two money committees can help out with that. Um, yeah, I think typically those, if they're earmarked programs, they're pretty specifically going to the project as outlined. Um, Housing is clearly a statewide concern, and anything that we can do to help with that will help everywhere. Uh, I Otherwise, I hadn't really been deep following that, so maybe Representative Morrissey or Nigro has more to say.
I'll hop over to you, Representative Nigro, because I think when people see a big dollar amount like that, they're also curious how that then intersects with something like the state budgeting process.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll be honest, my answer is not much different than Representative Durfee's, which is I don't we haven't really looked at. I mean, I've read the headline. Could it affect the state budgeting? Again, earmarked federal dollars; those are fairly direct. They really won't have a big impact on Vermont's budget. Obviously, great impact. Wonderful to see that money coming into Vermont and to Vermont projects. Um, Probably not a specific impact in our budgeting. Again, usually that wouldn't be going to a project that is already being funded through some other state funding source. So I don't think it would be something where we'd be saying, oh, hey, now we don't have to spend this money on something. Usually those federal earmarks are coming in simply because no other funding source has been identified.
That makes sense. And Representative Morrissey, just from our Bennington perspective, what would the hopes be for these sorts of programs?
Well, if you are referencing the announcement that was made yesterday, is that the announcement of the funding that was received?
Yes, that's the one.
Okay, because I think actually it was more than 60 million. I think it was almost around 100 million from what I saw on the the breakdown of it. But again, I think it had a number of areas that it was going to help in especially rural parts of Vermont and some of the initiatives, but like my other two colleagues on this program, we didn't have great detail as to what, but I am sure that the different agencies are looking very carefully at, especially with the housing. I know our committee has, we've got a bill, and what we're looking at is actually the governor did an executive order, even though one of my committee members had put a bill in regards to it, looking at properties the state may own around the state to see if, for housing especially, is that if they're underused, are these buildings that we should be looking at to provide housing in our communities? And we've been taking some testimony on that, and we do think, obviously it's now in as an executive order, but we do think it has merit to look at, the different buildings within, especially if they're state owned or lands even, to see if it would work within the parameters of what we're trying to do statewide to increase our housing, for folks, of whether it's workforce housing or low income housing or whatever kind, of housing. We need to look at all of those areas, to improve upon our inventory of housing. So.
Excellent. And I do want to connect that question of housing to the last subject I wanted us to cover, which is the winter that we're all experiencing this year, both the snowfall and the extreme cold temperatures, and the question of what kinds of shelter are available to people, which is both a question of housing and then also more temporary sheltering opportunities, and where the state funding to support that work looks like it's going right now. Obviously, most folks are familiar with the hotel voucher program that's been in place for the last several years. And then this past year, there was also $1.1 million put into an extreme cold weather shelter program that sought to create regional shelters in several areas of the state, working in combination with existing local partners to expand capacity for any nights that would go below 10 degrees below zero, including wind chill. So that would be the real feel, not the real temperature of -10 overnight. And so that's something that has now started up these emergency cold weather shelters in many different parts of the state. But just reflecting on a winter like this and where the state's energy, financial and otherwise, is going around the question of protecting especially the most vulnerable populations in this kind of weather when housing is such a challenge. I'll go to you, Representative Durfee.
Yeah, I think it's been maybe 3 weeks now of temperatures not rising above freezing. And then, as we know, many nights where it's gotten down to -10 or so, no one can survive in those conditions. And the motel voucher program has the beleaguered motel voucher program. Everyone has long recognized it's not ideal, not the best use of funding, but in the absence of other viable alternatives, we continue to go back again and again to that's what we have. I know that the Human Services Committee has taken a lot of testimony over the past several weeks, that they're working hard on a bill that is still taking shape, and working with stakeholders, working with housing advocates, working with the administration to try and come up with something that will pass, and it won't be vetoed. I think we remember at the end of the last session, the governor vetoed a bill that would have moved in a new direction. And I think a lot of what may still come out this year will seem similar to a lot that was in that bill. I don't want to say anything more because that's about what I know, other than to say that the fact that we're having this conversation in January adds, rather than June, adds urgency. I think that hopefully we'll get something through shortly.
And Representative Morrissey, you are someone who has raised some of those concerns about the motel voucher program and the amount of money going into something that feels like a Band-Aid rather than a more permanent fix for some of these challenges. What are some of your thoughts, especially experiencing a winter like this, going into a legislative session that might be seeking some solutions?
Well, again, yeah, I want us to take care of our most vulnerable in the state. My concerns with the hotel motel voucher system was we virtually paid out several hundred millions of dollars for that program, and technically at the end of the day we don't have anything to. Yes, we kept people to a degree safe, but it was not ideal situations when you had families living in a motel room, sometimes with 2 or 3 children. Um, it just was not an ideal, setting. But like I said, we did not, at the end of the day, after spending all of that money, nothing solid to really show that we had any new housing that could help going forward. And that was really my concerns. I think of what several hundred million, could have, if it was, well thought out in our communities to provide such, housing opportunities for folks struggling, especially with homelessness. And, that's why even when I spoke earlier about the, looking at buildings within our state and in our communities to see what we could use, properties that can provide housing, but also protection. And, I was surprised this week in hearing Burlington, again, because of the, 10, I think it was 10 below zero was the kind of the benchmark. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, people being out even when it's below 32 degrees is a very difficult and challenging means. And I know they said Burlington was just opening, I think, a couple of their shelters for folks. I don't know, what else they had, whether warming stations or that for folks. But, that's very difficult when you are struggling and don't have a means of getting out of the weather conditions. And, not for just a night or two, for long term. So, we are looking to work harder, especially seeing it in a year that we have had record lows in temperature and snow conditions and everything else. And I'm very appreciative of, the shelters that have been put are organized here in our community. I know the Unitarian Church has a day or two or like a warming station where people can come in and get warm and something warm or hot to eat or drink. And then I know St. Peter's has their the setup for an actual shelter. But we've got to plan better to help our most vulnerable.
And exactly to your point, having been involved a little bit with that emergency cold weather shelter at St. Peter's that is funded through this current state program with the negative 10-degree overnight activation threshold, there have been a lot of challenges about when folks who are operating the shelter really hope to open versus when they are able to open based on the activation temperatures. And some of that comes down to a question of cost. There's a certain dollar amount associated with the emergency cold weather shelter program. It's calculated for a certain number of nights of activation for a certain amount of reimbursement for each site. And so I want to finish up with you, Representative Nigro, sort of on the budget adjustment and the budgeting side. What does it look like either for a similar kind of emergency cold weather shelter program or a different way of addressing this challenge? What does that look like sort of from the state money side?
The governor's proposed budget, I mean, there's still over $30 million dispersed a little differently than last year, moving more money into a shelter model than into motel vouchers. But there's still an awful lot of money in the budget devoted to this issue. I had hoped that H91 was going to pass last year and get us on a path here, but I think there's two truths to this issue, and I hear from constituents on both sides of this. Obviously, I hear from a lot of folks worried about, the safety of vulnerable Vermonters. And so I think that's important to everybody. Again, we want to make sure that, it's nobody wants to look at this weather and you just can't even imagine somebody not being housed in these situations. But I also, the folks that call me worried about the cost end of this, I don't think they are wrong. We used to spend $3 to $5 million a year on the GA housing program prior to about 2019, 2020. And we've been spending $40 up to $50 million a year since then. And we need to be on a better path. I think the shelter model, there's a lot of hope that the problem is in a motel. We're keeping people safe, but we're not providing those wraparound services. In a shelter model, perhaps we can do a lot more to get people into permanent housing and reduce the cost long range. So there's still a lot of money in the budget devoted to this issue. I think we need to be looking for an answer that both takes care of people, but does have an eye on reducing the amount we spend on this by getting folks into permanent housing.
Absolutely. And to that point about the shelter program or the hotel program not necessarily having wraparound services, one of the challenges has been where are there available hotel rooms? For instance, there was someone who came to the emergency shelter here in Bennington after having been brought in by emergency services who had arranged for a hotel voucher, and it turned out the voucher was for a room in Hartford, Connecticut. And so that may be technically a hotel room and one that the voucher would pay for, but not necessarily one that the person could actually get to or return from, or a place where they would, have any connection, not just to services, but even to a community that they're familiar with. So the structural problems are not only clearly well known, but they are borne out by the experience. Plenty more for us to discuss on upcoming episodes of In Session. I want to thank the three of you for joining me this morning and for all of your insights and for being willing to stretch a little bit into some of the Senate side of things and the federal side of things. I appreciate your insights and your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Jack.